Hi everybody, hope you're doing well. My name is Coach Bott. I'm a strength and conditioning coach in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and a university level instructor. Great start. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about recovery. So we're not talking about hangover cures or parents with lack of sleep. We're talking about how it might pertain to the high performance athlete in this episode of Think Like a Scientist, Act Like a Coach. So this is sort of my life here. I get lots of questions like this. It says, hey coach, what do you think of the new recovery method that combines deep sea floating with red grapeseed extract and big toe massages? Which is not really a thing, but as you probably know, but it is a good question in the sense that there are a lot of recovery modalities out there. And what I will start with is by saying that this lecture is not at all about recovery modalities. This lecture is about the time it takes for the body to restore itself physiologically from different types of exercise stimulus. And all these fancy modalities don't really work anyways unless you're eating well and you're getting lots of sleep. So that's where I always start with my athletes. How much are you sleeping? And I guess a trivia question to all of you would be, what do athletes need in terms of sleep? And it is more than 8 hours. And it also is individual to some extent. And then obviously they need to be eating well. So let's just move on to our topic. So the process of recovery is kind of interesting, and there's a sort of a slow phase part of a process, and there is a fast phase, and that's the focus for today's little video tutorial. So the aim of the recovery process is to restore the body to its pre-exercise state. So that word is actually called homeostasis, and it's sort of a word that my college students learn in first year, and we talk a lot about how the body regulates itself and how it tries to find its way back to baseline. So that's essentially what we are talking about. How long does it take after I do X before my body goes back to where it likes to be at baseline? So essentially, when we're talking about recovery today, I'm going to talk about two things. Removal of byproducts if the stimulus created a byproduct. Some stimulus don't. And also, what about replenishment of the fuel? So if you did a very exhaustive workout, a lot of times nutritionists and registered dietitians are going to recommend that you refuel afterwards. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So the first fancy word we're going to mention is EPOC. And EPOC stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So let's just have a look at the word excess. So excess means, an abundance of, right? Post-exercise. Okay, we have an abundance of oxygen being consumed after we're finished exercise. Gee, that's pretty easy, right? A bunch of exercise we've done and a bunch of oxygen consumed. All right. We also used to call this oxygen debt. So some of the textbooks that you might read, and the textbook I got a lot of this information from, which is the Powers textbook in exercise physiology, call it oxygen debt. So you do need to know both terms because they mean the same thing, especially if you're reading literature. So what is it? It's the excess oxygen consumption above that at a resting level during recovery. And it's used to restore the body to a pre-exercise state. So what we can argue is after we're finished exercise, and we haven't talked about what we've done yet, we will, our body's going to consume more oxygen in order to get back to its pre-exercise state. So some people in the fitness industry call this afterburn or metabolic, something to do with metabolism, like an elevated metabolism. Well, metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in your body. So I don't really know what they're talking about when they say things like that. Don't use the term afterburn. You're too intelligent for that. Okay, we're going to use science, or we're going to say oxygen debt, we're going to say EPOC. Are we going to use this terminology with our clients? Absolutely not. We're going to have it in the back of our minds as part of the prescription and training solution process. All right, let's roll. So I'll give you an example. If you went out for a run, apparently someone has just sent me a friend request, apologize for that. If you go out for a run and you stop running immediately, you just stop. Is your heart rate still up? Yes. Is your breathing rate still up? Yes. So what does that tell you? You're going to die. No, I'm joking. It means that you are experiencing the first phase of EPOC. Okay, so it's not like we stop moving and all of a sudden everything just immediately goes back to normal. It doesn't. It takes some time and some things have to happen for that to roll out. So let's look at a picture, because pictures are nice. And on the y-axis here, we have something called oxygen consumption. So if from bottom to top, this is low and this would be high. So oxygen consumption is really low. Obviously, when we're resting, we consume about 5 to 6 liters of oxygen per minute. And then as we start to exercise, depending on what we're doing, the body needs to consume more. So here we go. We start exercising. Let's just imagine this person is out doing a pretty heavy run, okay, for lack of a better example. They're going to start to exercise. The demands of the work matches sort of their oxygen consumption. And then what happens is the demands of the work actually kind of start to exceed that at the beginning. So in the first couple of minutes of exercise, we're always in what we call oxygen deficit, which means that the demands of the work are exceeding the amount of oxygen we're able to supply. And this is because anaerobic metabolism simply dominates at the first few minutes of exercise, even if you're just out for a run, which would be considered aerobics or aerobic activity. And this is why I struggle with classifying things as aerobic and anaerobic. I personally struggle with this. This is my personal issue. You guys don't have to worry about me. But, you know, at the end of the day, at the beginning of exercise, you're in a deficit of oxygen. That kind of makes sense. And then if I reach a pace that I can maintain, off I go. So this is time. So let's say this is about usually around 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to hit something called steady state, which means I'm just in cruise control. The oxygen requirements are meeting the demands of the work and what I'm able to supply, essentially. Then I finish exercise. Okay, so I cruise along, then I finish exercise after X amount of minutes, and I have this process now called EPOC. So this green area, this window from the time you finish your training session to the time you reach baseline again, is called EPOC. And this is what recovery is all about. Now, obviously, if I'm talking about sleeping and eating, I'm talking about recovery on a very global scale. I'm not talking about a work-to-rest ratio, but today I'm going to be talking more about a work-to-rest ratio and why we rest for the length of time that we do. So essentially, we've got 2 phases of EPOC. I bet you didn't know that. We have the initial rapid recovery stage. We call that the Alactacid Debt. That's sort of more of a coaching term. And then we have the slow recovery stage, which is this stage here. And essentially one occurs before the other, and the size of the EPOC does depend on what you have done for your workload. All right, I've already mentioned oxygen deficit here, but let's just give you a textbook definition. It basically can be thought of as the extra amount of oxygen that would be needed to complete the entire activity anaerobically. So if you started working aerobically, did I say anaerobically? If you started working aerobically right away, then the oxygen requirement would match the demands of the work. But in physiology, our body doesn't do that. It always works anaerobically first, and then we shift, almost like driving a standard car, into that 3rd gear or 4th gear where things are more leveled off. And I call that cruise control when I'm sort of explaining that to my students. So that's what oxygen deficit is. Okay, let's look back at EPOC here, and let's look at this rapid phase at the beginning. So you've finished your run, you've done 6 lovely laps around the track, you've stopped, okay? And maybe now you're just walking and you've grabbed your water bottle and you're sort of just sauntering along. What's going on? Well, we have definitely elevated respiration, right? So our breathing rate is up, and that's really important because that helps to actually start to resynthesize. And resynthesize means to make or to create more stores of ATP and phosphocreatine in our muscles. So all of us have a different genetic amount of phosphocreatine stored, and that's another lecture. And we all have enough ATP in our muscles stored for about 3 seconds of maximal effort. So if you think about it, if you've gone for a long run, you're going to be depleting some of that. You never hit rock bottom, but we want to brush up on those stores. So by bringing oxygen back into the equation and by respirating, we start to begin to restore those fuel sources or those substrates. It also replenishes the muscle stores of myoglobin and hemoglobin. And I liken these two guys like wheelbarrows, and they carry oxygen through the bloodstream to the muscle. Myoglobin does a really specific job, and it carries it right into the fiber, where hemoglobin actually carries it from the heart through the vascular network to the capillaries that surround the muscle. So those are very, very important because we actually start to replenish the stores of myoglobin and hemoglobin during recovery. Keep that in mind, that if you're doing interval training during those periods of recovery, you're actually already starting to restore those things. And maybe that's why recovery is important. It takes about 3 minutes for the ATP PC stores to fully recover. So in about 30 seconds, 50% are restored, and about 75% are restored in about a minute. So it does take about 3 minutes. What you'll see later on is if you're doing pure speed sessions and you're tackling this energy system or this pathway, you actually may need to rest longer than 3 minutes because there's other fatiguing mechanisms going on as well. Now, right now, all I'm talking about is depletion of a substrate. So depletion of ATP and phosphocreatine. So again, if you think about doing a 3RM on a power clean, over that period of work, you're probably resting anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes between sets. And now you see why. Now, the second half of recovery is much longer. It's called the Lactacid Debt, or the slow recovery stage. And this is responsible for the reconversion of lactate. Notice that I didn't use the word removal of lactate. Lactate is also a fuel source. Okay, it's a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism that gets recreated into different types of substrates that the body can use to continue to make energy. So let's say you're doing more of a repeat interval training type session around the track, and you've changed the pH of your blood slightly. You've accumulated a little bit of lactic acid, which is quickly converted to lactate. And then you start doing some recovery in between your intervals. And during that recovery, that lactate starts to get recycled and starts to be converted. It gets converted to pyruvic acid, which is the end result of glycolysis. So it can enter the Krebs cycle for aerobic metabolism. It can be converted back into stored fuel, glycogen and glucose. Those are how we store carbs in our body. And it can also be converted into proteins or amino acids, which can be used for fuel as well in sort of a last-ditch effort, if you will. So that is why it's very important to, again, make sure that you've got recovery inserted. Obviously, at the end of a training session, you're not going to go straight from a heavy sort of lactate tolerance session right into a wrestling practice. That wouldn't make a lot of sense because you're still in this recovery stage. And this recovery can be sped up using different modalities, which I'll show you at the end today. This slow recovery stage also helps to support elevated metabolic functions that take place after exercise. So when we talk about elevated metabolism, I want you to think more along the lines of chemical reactions that are taking place to bring the body back to its resting state. It has nothing to do with your burning more calories. I assume obviously that you are, but that shouldn't be the point of trying to extend the EPOC session. But there are people out there speaking on this topic. When you're talking about high performance and working with athletes, workouts need to be repeatable. So if I'm so, shit kicked, pardon my language, that I can't repeat a session maybe the next day or a couple of days later because of recovery, then that's not a good thing, or I can't go to practice and have good quality practice. So what I'm dealing with as well are high body temperatures. I'm also dealing with hormones that are circulating like adrenaline. And I'm also dealing with cardiac output being elevated. So that's our heart rate times our stroke volume. And that actually helps to decrease and reduce the body temperature. So that slow recovery stage has a lot to do with being hot. And how many of you have ever done a hard workout, hard training session, finished the session, did a cool down, hit the showers, got out of the shower, started eating, and you're still sweating? Well, there you go. Now you know why. So I'm going to give you guys some general points about recovery and then some tips, and hopefully you've got some more knowledge that you can use to help you program your athletes' training and your clients' training. So EPOC will always be present at any exercise intensity. That's important to note because, again, these fat burning experts will say, oh, we have to have EPOC. Well, EPOC's always there. Even if you walked up a flight of stairs that was, say 45 stairs and you stopped at the top, would we all agree that our breathing rate's going to be high and our heart rate's high? Yes. Would we all agree you'd probably recover from that in 2 to 3 minutes? Yes. But we still have EPOC taking place. It just is a smaller EPOC than if you did repeated intervals around a track for an hour. So this oxygen deficit, which is the shortage of oxygen supply during exercise, and EPOC are both lower during aerobic activity. So if the activity you're doing isn't very metabolically disturbing, meaning it's not changing the pH in your blood, it's not very intense, then the oxygen deficit and the EPOC are going to be lower. And this is, again, where the fat burning experts say, oh, don't do any slow, steady state training. Just do high intensity training. You're going to burn more fat. Well, you might not burn more fat, but you could use more energy when you're done the workout. I agree with that. I can't disagree. But it doesn't mean you're going to get fitter. It could mean you could get leaner. So it is possible to get leaner without getting fitter. Aerobic exercise shows a steady state where oxygen supply meets the requirements of the exercise and therefore has a smaller EPOC. Okay, so a small EPOC and a small oxygen deficit and not high levels of lactate. Now, anaerobic exercise, and again, I do struggle with calling exercise aerobic or anaerobic exclusively because everything is mixed, but let's say anaerobic metabolism is the dominant energy system. So we're doing like sort of glycolytic type work, and we're doing work where we can't maintain that work for 20 minutes straight. You have to do, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, that sort of thing. Then we could start to classify it as more anaerobic. And what we know with that type of work is that it increases the oxygen deficit, increases the onset of blood lactate, and it produces higher levels of lactate that require removal and recycling, and therefore a higher EPOC. So again, you will extend EPOC and then extend recovery time when you're doing more high intensity, more anaerobic dominant work. So that's an important consideration as a coach. If I do a heavy aerobic power session with my wrestlers on a Saturday morning, I can pretty much guarantee to them that within 4 to 6 hours, if they eat properly and they relax in the afternoon, they're going to be recovered from that session. And they don't actually train again until Monday morning. So they actually have a lot of passive recovery even on Sunday. And my goal with that is by the time we get back to training on Monday morning, that they're almost fully recovered, rested, and ready to tackle a new week. So knowing the timelines of recovery is really, really important when you're designing a microcycle, which is a week of training, and you're trying to account for practices, and you're trying to account for weight training, speed training, and endurance training. Another important consideration during recovery is to remove carbon dioxide. So again, if we have a heavy anaerobic session, we're going to produce a lot of carbon dioxide during exercise, and it's removed by combining with water in the blood plasma, and it's also removed by combining with hemoglobin. So there's that molecule again. It also not only shuttles oxygen through the blood to the muscles, it actually shuttles carbon dioxide through the venous system back to the heart. So that's very, very important to keep in mind, that we are removing carbon dioxide as well during the recovery process, and that's why we have a higher respiration rate after exercise. So high metabolic function, so all these chemical reactions, along with the chemoreceptors, which are little receptors that sense a disturbance in a chemical environment, they detect the elevated levels of CO2, Then they stimulate the heart, they stimulate the brain that is controlling the heart and controlling the lungs, and tell the heart and the lungs to continue to work at a faster rate to remove the carbon dioxide. So when we have a high heart rate after exercise and we have an elevated respiration rate, it's not necessarily a sign that someone's deconditioned. The body is doing its job physiologically to help remove the carbon dioxide. And then we also have to consider that we need to replenish glycogen stores, especially if we're doing prolonged work. If we're doing a weight training session that's 30 to 45 minutes long with a sort of a small volume load, obviously that's going to be extremely relative, but just to paint a little bit of a picture, we're not going to worry about depletion of glycogen. If you're a bench warmer on the basketball team and you didn't get in the first half of the game, you're not going to really worry about replenishing glycogen. But if you are a starter and you did play 95% of the minutes in the first half, and the coaches have you running a running gun offense with a full court press defense or something like that, you're going to have to eat after you exercise, or maybe even at halftime. So that glycogen can be replaced in up to 10 to 12 hours after exercise, but it's really, really important to eat. So that's why I just sort of wrote nom 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 here is important, but I'll leave that to the RDNs and the sport dietitians, and I recommend either Dana Liss or Kelly Drager with our CSI sport system in Canada. They're phenomenal practitioners and scientists, and they can give much better advice into timelines and dosages of fuel. Now let's move into implications for planning and coaching, because this is probably what you're most interested in. So if you've fallen asleep, which I don't blame you, it's time to wake up and put the stuff into practice. So obviously we need to understand recovery. We need to have some kind of guidelines for planning training sessions and to take into account things like work intensity and recovery intervals, especially when we use interval training. And, I will go ahead and say that weight training is really interval training for the most part. You're doing work and then you're resting, right? And we need to have an idea of how long that rest needs to be. So having correct work to recovery ratio during interval training is more efficient, right? Because it helps to increase the quality and intensity of training, and it improves adaptations. You can't train intensely without recovery. I'll say that again. You cannot train intensely without recovery. So if you don't insert enough recovery into a person's training program, they can't reach a 10 out of 10 on a Borg scale, on a modified Borg scale. They can't push at 95% of their maximal speed or strength in the weight room because they're fatigued, because they're tired. Okay, so we need to make sure that we adhere to these ratios that are published because they improve adaptation in our clients. And we need to educate the client. With personal training clients, it's hard because they don't often want to sit and wait and rest in between sets, right? And so the trainer starts to feel a little bit anxious and like, oh, maybe I should make them do, a whole bunch of trisets and supersets. Well, it depends. If you want to get them stronger and more powerful, they may need to just rest, and you just need to educate them on that. So this chart here is interesting. It actually comes out of the Journal of Wrestling Science, and it was produced, by some Russian scientists. And you can sort of see within the translation a little bit of it is lost, but if we're doing like sort of anaerobic work and the working time is 40 to 50 seconds, so here, the work to rest ratio is around 1 to 3. They don't make a lot of indications around passive versus active rest and so on, but it gives you guys a bit of an idea of work to rest time on this table, and then even sets and reps. So this would be your total training volume. So it's not a bad table to refer to, but keep in mind, this was published in the Journal of Wrestling Science with very highly trained people. So if you're a personal trainer working with newbies, I might recommend anecdotally that you prescribe about 30% of this volume to the average person. So that tends to be the difference between, average Joe or the NARP, non-athletic recreational person, to the elite athlete. Okay, so elite athletes can typically handle a higher dose of the work, but all the principles are exactly the same. How you train them is exactly the same. So here's some solutions for you guys. So if you want to improve speed and you're exploiting the ATP PC system, obviously the athlete's probably doing ballistic work that's less than 10 seconds in length. The recovery is going to be really long. Now, if I go back to that previous slide, I think it said somewhere around 1 to 3. I'm going to tell you this, it's actually 1 to 12 to 1 to 20 work to rest when you want to improve speed. This is a really interesting anecdote, and that ratio is actually out of the NSCA strength and conditioning textbook. And another rule of thumb is for every 10 meters an athlete sprints, give them a minute of recovery. So if you're doing 40-yard sprints, I have a CFL athlete I train, and he's a special teams player. So a lot of his work on the field are very long sprints, and he's a 250-pound defensive end. So if he's doing these long sprints that are 40 meters, I'm giving him a minimum of 4 minutes. And in all honesty, with this athlete, it's usually 5 or 6 minutes so I can get good quality speed work in with him over a training session. So keep that in mind. So this will allow the ATP and the phosphocreatine stores to fully recover. And obviously that's not the only thing that needs to fully recover in between sets. But because the focus today is on the metabolic side of recovery, that's where we're going to go. All right, training solutions for improving the body's tolerance to lactate. So we've got, aerobic training where we can push that lactate curve to the right, which is great, and we definitely want to tackle that. But there is a bit of tug of war. We may still need to do some anaerobic work with athletes to get them to tolerate and buffer lactate and get the enzymes active and come off the bench that help them metabolize that substrate more rapidly and help them resynthesize it. So essentially, you might want to try this, and this isn't the only method I use, but I like this method where you keep the work to still around 10 seconds, but you might start to decrease the relief ratio. So like a 1 to 2 versus that 1 to 12 or 1 to 3 even. Which means you're essentially only restoring about 50% of the ATP PC stores. And you might want to even start with week 1, you give them a 1 to 4, week 2, you give them a 1 to 3, week 3, you give them a 1 to 2 of the same work stimulus. You could also try this, you could extend the work interval, so a 20 to 60 seconds, and that's a huge window. So you're going to need to pick one or the other or something in the middle, and then have a recovery interval of around 3 to 5 times the work. Does that make sense? So if it's 20 seconds on, you might want to give them a minute off, or you might want to give them a minute and a half off. It really does depend on the stimulus, the modality, the athlete's training status, how fit they are from a VO2 standpoint. I'm fortunate. I'm working with athletes with VO2s that are typically over about 53. So they're fit, they're conditioned, they can handle more volume, and they can handle higher workload. So these are some general guidelines, okay? Give it a go and let me know. Now, if I want to improve the performance aerobic capacity, now I'm going to be doing longer duration work just below the anaerobic threshold. I should have put a little star there. That should be tested. You can do a critical power or critical velocity test to test that. And essentially that rest interval is typically equal to the work interval. So it might be like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. So it's a 1-to-1. And that helps to delay muscular fatigue, and it helps to develop the aerobic system. And the rest can be less for longer intervals. So for example, with my population, if we start doing intervals of 4 to 5 minutes in duration in the off season, which we do, my rest periods are anywhere between 3 and 4 minutes with those athletes. So it's not always a 1-to-1. Sometimes it's actually a little bit less rest as the intervals get longer. So keep that in mind when you're training the aerobic system and trying to build aerobic capacity in an athlete. So let's give you 3 more slides here and we'll call it a day. Some tips. So warm up thoroughly. Apparently there's an exclamation mark there instead of a Y, so I apologize for that. This will help reduce oxygen deficit by increasing oxygen supply to the muscles and ensure all the myoglobin stores are full, locked and loaded, ready to go. I can't stress enough what a progressive warm-up can do for a training session. And maybe I need to do a tutorial video just on that. Use active cool downs from anaerobic work where we accumulate lactate. So I always recommend my athletes after wrestling practice hit the exercise bike for 15 to 20 minutes, working at around 55 to 60%, 65% of their heart rate reserve. They all know what level that is. A moderate intensity seems to be ideal for active recovery. I just mentioned that. Anaerobic and speed or lactate tolerance training will actually help to increase the stores of our ATP and phosphocreatine. So you want to think about when you're doing these training sessions, it's not just about trying to build someone's conditioning or fitness, or you want to think more about what does that entail? And it entails better storage of the fuels you're going to need for that type of work. Make sure you have correct work to rest ratios, you guys. Make sure you maintain those. I've given you a few examples. I've given you some ranges to work with. There's lots of great information out there in those areas. We've got Paul Larson's work, Billett's work, that's B-I-L-L-A-T, Olbrich's work, Jan Olbrich. There's The Science of Running by Steve Magnus, which isn't bad. So there's lots of great information. I didn't put citations in this lecture today because, to be honest, I grabbed a lot of this stuff from other slides I've put together and sort of synthesized it. But if you want research and citations or a reference list, just let me know. I have one and I can send that off to you on email. Use velocity and pacing to control and or alter intensity to meet training objectives. So you can do this, but you need to do critical power testing if you want to get an idea of velocity or pace. You could also do a beep test with an athlete, and you can actually, there's lots of literature that correlates the stage the athlete reaches on a beep test and what that is in kilometers per hour and then in meters per second. So if you're using a treadmill, for example, to condition an athlete, you can actually do those sessions based on speed, and they tend to be a more accurate way to train than using heart rate. Also, aerobic training will help to improve oxygen supply during and after recovery from exercise. I can't stress that enough, that athletes need to do some aerobic training. And how much they need to do depends on where they're at. You need to test them. You need to figure that out. If that athlete can't, complete a staged protocol or a Bruce protocol on a bike, if they're an O lineman or at a decent level of whatever the bare minimum level is in aerobic fitness, then you've got a lot of work to do in just pulling that up initially. Obviously, a mix of aerobic and anaerobic training will help with thresholds. It will help delay the ATP-PC system sort of pooping out or getting tired or exhausted. You might be able to now sprint at a high velocity for 8 seconds versus 6 seconds. So you can exploit each of those systems within those time frames. So keep that in mind as well. I like to use heart rate as an indicator of recovery between lactate tolerance intervals and between aerobic capacity intervals. I don't always necessarily use it for the work because sometimes it's a maximal effort, or sometimes I'm looking purely at frequency of movement, or I'm looking at velocity or pace. But use those heart rate monitors, put them on the athletes, and make sure that they're down to at least 130 beats per minute before they do the next interval. And that might tell you how long to prescribe rest periods for, right? You don't necessarily have to go back to my notes and go, oh, well, it's a 1 to 3. It's got to be that. And the athlete's heart rate's still 155. If it's still 155, they are not ready physiologically to do the next interval and give you quality work. So you need to make that call, and there's a tip. Well, that's it for today, folks.